Welcome back to Rapture Tales. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and get ready for another story you won't forget. Let's dive back to the story. Rowan Carter's termination happened at 9:12 in the morning, and what he remembered most wasn't the words but the silence afterward. The HR representative kept talking, something about restructuring, budget alignment, unavoidable downsizing, but her voice sounded distant, like it was traveling across water. The office around him continued functioning normally. Keyboards clicked. Someone laughed from a cubicle aisle. A printer jammed and beeped impatiently. His world had ended, and nobody noticed. He carried a cardboard box through the glass lobby of Halverson Freight Solutions while rain streaked the windows in thin diagonal lines. The security guard who had greeted him every day for 3 years avoided eye contact as Rowan passed, and that small gesture hurt more than the job loss itself. Outside, the air felt colder than it should have for late spring. Rowan stood there for several minutes holding the box, trying to decide where a person went when routine disappeared. He eventually boarded a bus he didn't remember choosing, rode it to the end of the line, and realized halfway home he had rehearsed what to say to his family. Reassurance first, optimism second, because he believed family was the place collapse could land safely. Patricia Carter answered his call on the second ring, but the warmth he expected never arrived. She listened without interruption, then sighed sharply as if inconvenienced. She asked why he hadn't prepared for something like this and reminded him she had always warned him logistics was unstable work. Rowan tried explaining the layoffs affected hundreds of employees, but she kept speaking over him, her tone tightening into disappointment rather than sympathy. By the end of the call she told him he needed to figure things out quickly because she couldn't support another adult child. The line disconnected before he finished responding. Rowan stared at his phone, waiting for a follow-up text that never came. When he called Melissa, it went straight to voicemail. Eric sent a single reply, "Busy right now." Leonard Pierce didn't respond at all. The apartment felt larger that night, empty in a way space shouldn't be, and Rowan realized support had not merely failed to appear, it had actively withdrawn. 3 days later the final message arrived. It was a group text he discovered hours late because he'd been at a job fair handing out resumes to distracted recruiters. The message read that it would be better if he skipped the upcoming holiday gathering until things stabilized, because relatives would ask uncomfortable questions. Rowan reread the sentence until its meaning sharpened. They didn't want him seen. When he tried calling, every number failed except Eric's, which rang once before disconnecting. Then even that stopped. Blocked. The realization didn't come as a shock but as a slow closing door. He sat on the floor beside his kitchen counter eating canned soup straight from the container because he hadn't washed dishes in days. Outside his window a couple argued about parking, their voices alive with ordinary problems, and Rowan envied them because their lives still had shape. His no longer did. The first eviction notice came folded under his door like a polite apology. Rowan negotiated an extra week, sold his television, then his watch, then the extra chair he never used. Each object leaving felt less like sacrifice and more like erosion. At the food bank he learned to stand in lines without making eye contact because pride only complicated hunger. That was where he first met Mrs. Eleanor Whitcomb, who volunteered every Wednesday cataloging donation records on an old laptop. She asked him why he kept reading the instruction pamphlets on the table instead of taking food. Rowan admitted he was trying to stretch time before returning to an empty apartment. She studied him carefully, noticing the logistics certification printed faintly on his worn resume folder, and asked if he had ever considered learning software systems behind distribution networks. Rowan laughed quietly. He didn't even have stable internet, but she wrote the public library hours on a receipt and told him curiosity cost nothing. The library became his refuge because it was heated and nobody asked why he stayed all day. Rowan spent hours reading about database structures, supply algorithms, and routing optimization, copying notes by hand because computer access was limited to short sessions. Mrs. Whitcomb quietly extended his time whenever she supervised the desk. He started mapping imaginary warehouse networks on scrap paper, designing efficiency improvements for companies that would never know his name. The work gave his mind traction again. For the first time since losing his job, he felt forward movement instead of slow sinking. Across the hall of his apartment lived Clara Bennett, a night shift nurse whose schedule intersected Rowan's insomnia. She noticed the growing stack of job rejection envelopes near his door and began leaving leftover packaged meals on the radiator outside his apartment without knocking. Rowan initially thought the landlord was responsible until he caught her returning from work one morning. She didn't ask invasive questions, only whether he preferred chicken or pasta because the hospital cafeteria offered both at closing. The normalcy of the conversation unsettled him more than pity would have. It had been weeks since someone spoke to him as though his situation were temporary rather than defining. Winter arrived early that year. The heating unit in Rowan's building failed repeatedly, forcing tenants into layers of clothing indoors. He started waking before dawn to catch temporary warehouse shifts unloading trucks, work that paid barely enough to delay eviction. During one shift he reorganized pallet staging to speed unloading, shaving nearly 30 minutes off turnaround time. The floor supervisor accused him of interfering, but the operations manager overheard the explanation and asked him to demonstrate again. Rowan didn't get a permanent position, but he was asked to return whenever shipments ran heavy. It wasn't stability, yet it was proof his mind still held value somewhere beyond his past job title. One late evening at the library, Rowan remained after closing while Mrs. Whitcomb balanced inventory records. A man in a dark coat approached the help desk asking about regional freight infrastructure statistics. The databases were complex, and Mrs. Whitcomb gestured toward Rowan, joking that he spent enough time there to qualify as staff. Rowan hesitated but helped interpret the shipping maps, explaining inefficiencies between regional hubs and suggesting a rerouting concept he'd been sketching for weeks. The stranger listened carefully, asking precise questions. His name was Daniel Harrow, founder of a young logistics technology company struggling to refine its predictive routing platform. He didn't offer promises, only a business card and an invitation to visit the office if Rowan believed his ideas held up under real data. Rowan stared at the card for 2 days before going. The office of Meridian Gate Logistics was small, noisy, and chaotic, whiteboards layered with half-erased equations and coffee cups everywhere. Maya Rios, the lead systems engineer, challenged every assumption he made within minutes, dismantling his proposal point by point. Instead of discouragement, Rowan felt something awaken. Intellectual resistance felt like oxygen after months of silence. By evening Daniel asked if he would accept a temporary operations assistant role, low pay, long hours, just to see whether his instincts translated into execution. Rowan agreed before doubt could intervene. It wasn't rescue. It was entry. His first weeks were brutal. He sorted shipping tickets, cleaned mislabeled datasets, and slept barely 5 hours a night. Yet each solved problem restored a fragment of identity he thought gone forever. He stopped checking his phone for family messages because there were none to expect. Clara noticed he now left early each morning with purpose, and Mrs. Whitcomb insisted he print his name properly on his notes rather than writing small in the corners. Rowan Carter began rebuilding a life measured not by who abandoned him, but by what he refused to abandon in himself. Months passed, and the routing model he quietly refined reduced delivery delays for a trial client by nearly 12%. The office erupted in celebration around him while Rowan remained seated, overwhelmed less by success than by the unfamiliar sensation of belonging earned rather than assumed. Daniel clapped his shoulder, telling him they would talk about greater responsibility soon. Rowan walked home that night under clear winter stars, realizing the silence that once followed him no longer felt empty, it felt peaceful. Rowan's responsibilities at Meridian Gate Logistics expanded quietly rather than ceremoniously. Daniel never announced promotions. He simply stopped assigning certain tasks and waited to see who naturally stepped forward. One Monday morning Rowan found the operations dashboard unlocked and live client traffic running through it. Nobody told him to monitor it, yet Maya deliberately worked across the room instead of beside the console. When a routing cluster stalled near a coastal distribution port, alarms flickered across the interface. Rowan traced the delay to a data sync conflict between weather feeds and custom schedules, then wrote a patch that bypassed the lagging node. Trucks resumed movement within minutes. No applause followed, only Maya glancing up from her desk and nodding once before returning to her work. The gesture carried more weight than praise. For the first time, Rowan sensed he was no longer being tested to fail but trusted not to. That evening he returned home exhausted but steadier than he'd felt in years. Clara was sitting on the hallway floor outside her apartment, unlacing her shoes after a 12-hour shift. She asked how his numbers puzzle job was going, and Rowan described the shipping grid in simple terms, sketching imaginary highways in the air. She laughed at how animated he became, then admitted she'd started telling co-workers about the neighbor who talks to freight routes like they're people. The conversation drifted into personal territory, not forced, not prying, and Rowan realized he hadn't spoken about his past in months. He didn't mention his family yet. Instead he spoke about wanting stability, a place where effort didn't vanish overnight. Clara listened without interruption, the way nurses learn to listen, and told him stability rarely arrives. People build it piece by piece. The sentence lingered with him long after he went inside. Meridian Gate gained its first major regional client shortly after. The contract nearly collapsed within days when a competitor leaked misleading performance data about the company's software. Panic spread across the office. Investors called constantly. Daniel gathered the team around the central table and asked only one question: how to prove reliability in real time. Rowan proposed streaming live shipment metrics publicly for the client to monitor directly, bypassing speculation entirely. The idea risked exposing every flaw but also every success. They implemented it overnight. By dawn the client watched trucks complete routes faster than promised. The rumor dissolved instantly. Daniel later admitted the decision saved the company's reputation. Rowan didn't celebrate. He sat alone reviewing error logs, aware the difference between recognition and responsibility had just shifted permanently. Victor Lang noticed Meridian Gate then. As an executive at a dominant logistics firm, he monitored emerging competitors closely. He invited Daniel to a networking reception, a polite environment designed to measure threats behind smiles. Rowan attended reluctantly, wearing the only formal jacket he owned. During conversations, Victor directed subtle questions toward him instead of Daniel, probing weaknesses in their system architecture disguised as casual curiosity. Rowan answered cautiously, offering principles without revealing mechanics. The exchange became a silent duel neither acknowledged openly. On the ride back, Daniel laughed softly, saying Victor rarely bothered with small companies unless he sensed genuine potential. Rowan looked out the window, understanding success would now attract opposition just as surely as failure once attracted abandonment. Work days lengthened. Meyer and Rowan began staying after hours refining predictive models, arguing intensely over code efficiency before ordering late meals neither had time to eat hot. Their rivalry sharpened into respect. She stopped double-checking his solutions, and he stopped second-guessing his own. One night she admitted she'd assumed he was another short-term hire chasing tech trends, not someone rebuilding a life through systems. Rowan shrugged, saying systems made sense when people didn't. The honesty hung between them, uncomfortably human. They returned to coding without addressing it further, yet the office felt less like employment and more like partnership. Months later the company landed a multi-state distribution deal that required constant oversight. Rowan began arriving before sunrise to simulate worst-case scenarios and sleeping on the office couch when storms threatened routes. During a blizzard he manually coordinated rerouting for dozens of shipments while power flickered across the city grid. When morning cleared the roads, deliveries had remained on schedule across every region. The client sent a message calling it the most reliable operation they'd seen in years. Daniel forwarded the email to the team with a single line: Rowan handled the night. The recognition unsettled him, pride mixed with a memory of earlier years when effort went unseen. He walked outside into cold air to steady himself before returning to work. Clara noticed the change in him as winter softened into spring. He spoke less about survival and more about plans, future certifications, savings goals, long-term housing. She shared stories of patients rebuilding after accidents, people who discovered identity only after losing previous versions of themselves. Their conversations became routine evening pauses in the hallway, neither calling them meetings nor dates. When he finally mentioned his family blocking him, he described it simply, without bitterness. Clara didn't react with outrage. She asked whether he felt lighter without waiting for approval. Rowan realized he did. The absence no longer echoed, it left space. The company grew rapidly afterward. Rowan supervised teams now, guiding new hires through processes he once learned alone in a library. He kept Mrs. Whitcomb's handwritten resource list folded in his wallet, a reminder of where momentum began. On the anniversary of joining Meridian Gate, Daniel handed him revised partnership documents granting equity shares. Rowan read them twice before speaking. Ownership had never existed in his expectations, only stability. Daniel said the company worked because Rowan treated it as something to build rather than something to use. Signing the papers felt less like achieving success and more like accepting permanence. Late one evening, after the office emptied, Rowan walked through rows of humming servers and paused beside the operations board tracking shipments across the country. Thousands of moving points formed patterns only he and a few others fully understood. He remembered the cold apartment, the blocked numbers, the soup eaten from a can, and realized the memories no longer hurt, they contextualized. He wasn't trying to prove anyone wrong anymore. He was simply continuing forward. And without noticing the moment it happened, Rowan Carter stopped being the man who lost everything and became the man responsible for something others depended on. Growth changed the rhythm of Rowan's life long before he noticed the scale of it. Meridian Gate Logistics expanded into a larger building with glass conference rooms and a control floor overlooking rows of monitors mapping national freight movement in real time. Rowan now spent mornings reviewing projections with analysts who looked to him for decisions instead of instructions. He kept his voice calm even when shipments stacked dangerously close to deadlines, teaching them to think in contingencies rather than panic. Daniel gradually stopped attending routine operational meetings altogether, choosing instead to watch from the back wall or not appear at all. It became clear he was stepping away without announcing it. One afternoon he left Rowan alone during a negotiation with a manufacturing conglomerate known for aggressive terms. The executives expected concessions from someone younger. Rowan instead walked them through inefficiencies in their own distribution chain and explained how Meridian Gate would reduce their losses. By the end of the meeting the tone had shifted. They weren't granting Meridian Gate an opportunity, they were requesting partnership. When Rowan stepped outside afterward, he realized Daniel had been observing from the hallway the entire time and had intentionally let silence teach him authority. Julian Cross published the article 2 months later. The feature profiled Meridian Gate's rise in the logistics industry and focused heavily on Rowan's unconventional path. A systems architect who began as an operations assistant and rewrote routing efficiency across multiple regions. The piece spread quickly through business networks, then outward into public media. For the first time Rowan's name existed beyond internal reports and client emails. Messages from unknown professionals filled his inbox, invitations to conferences arrived daily, and former co-workers from Halverson Freight sent polite congratulations as though they had always believed in him. He read each one briefly but didn't dwell on them. The only thing he noticed was how easily recognition appeared once struggle ended, how noise followed stability. Clara teased him about becoming searchable, and Mrs. Whitcomb proudly printed the article and laminated it despite Rowan's protest. He folded it carefully and stored it in his desk, unsure whether the attention felt earned or simply inevitable. The first sign from his family came quietly. An unfamiliar number called his office line late afternoon while most staff were leaving. The caller paused after he answered, as if verifying the voice matched expectation, then hung up. Minutes later a second call came. This time a message was left, brief and uncertain. It was Eric. He spoke carefully, mentioning he'd heard about Rowan's work and hoped they could talk sometime. No apology, no explanation, only cautious familiarity. Rowan listened to it once and archived it without responding. The past did not surge back as anger. It arrived as distance. That night he walked home slower than usual, considering whether success changed people or simply revealed timing. Clara didn't push him when he told her. She only asked whether he felt obligated to reopen doors he had learned to live without. Rowan admitted he didn't know yet. Meridian Gate's board met the following week to discuss expansion into international routing markets. Daniel opened the meeting by announcing his intention to retire from active leadership within the year. The room erupted in overlapping concern until he raised a hand and stated he had already decided who would assume majority ownership, Rowan. The declaration stunned even Meyer, who rarely showed surprise. Rowan tried to protest, but Daniel explained leadership was proven through consistency, not tenure. Negotiations followed over weeks, valuations, legal structures, investment protections. Rowan studied every clause late into the night, determined not to inherit responsibility blindly. Signing the buyout agreement months later marked a moment quieter than anyone expected. No speeches, no celebration, only documents exchanged across a conference table and a handshake held longer than customary. When Daniel left the building carrying a single box of personal items, Rowan watched from his office window, aware an era had ended and another now depended entirely on his judgment. Pressure intensified immediately. Victor Lang's corporation launched competitive pricing campaigns targeting Meridian Gate's largest clients, forcing Rowan to respond strategically rather than emotionally. He restructured service tiers, invested in predictive maintenance for partner fleets, and introduced transparent tracking portals clients could access anytime. The moves required capital and risked short-term profit, but retention stabilized within months. During negotiations, Victor finally requested a direct meeting. They spoke privately in a neutral office tower overlooking the city. Victor admitted he had underestimated Rowan years earlier and offered acquisition terms generous enough to tempt most founders. Rowan declined calmly, explaining he built Meridian Gate to solve problems, not surrender them. As they parted, Victor's smile carried respect instead of challenge. Competition remained, but hostility dissolved into professional recognition. Meanwhile, Clara's life shifted as well. She received an offer to supervise a pediatric unit at a hospital across town, a promotion requiring relocation closer to the facility. They spent an evening walking through a riverside park discussing practicalities neither wanted to frame emotionally. Rowan encouraged her to accept. Stability meant growth for both of them, yet the thought of returning to a quiet hallway unsettled him. Clara noticed and promised distance did not equal absence. Their relationship had never been labeled, yet the bond was evident in what went unsaid. Weeks later, he helped carry her last boxes to a taxi at dawn before his workday began. The hallway returned to silence, but this time it felt transitional rather than empty. 6 months after the article, financial markets recognized Meridian Gate as a major industry player. Rowan's schedule filled with investor briefings and expansion planning, yet he kept one ritual unchanged. Every Wednesday he visited the library to thank Mrs. Whitcomb and donate updated computers for public use. She refused personal gifts but accepted resources for others' learning as he once had. During one visit she remarked that success had not altered his posture. He still entered as though permission were required. Rowan answered that remembering uncertainty kept decisions honest. As he left, he saw a young man studying freight manuals at the corner table and quietly placed a note listing online learning resources beside him before departing. Winter approached again when the family finally appeared in person. Reception informed Rowan that several visitors insisted on seeing him without appointment. Through the glass wall of the lobby he recognized them instantly despite years apart. Patricia standing rigid, Melissa scanning the interior with calculating interest, Eric avoiding eye contact, and Leonard speaking sharply to the desk attendant. Time compressed and stretched simultaneously. Rowan remained still for several seconds before instructing staff to bring them upstairs. Not out of eagerness, not out of fear, but because avoidance would leave questions unfinished. As the elevator ascended carrying the past toward his present, Rowan prepared himself not for confrontation, but for clarity. The elevator doors opened with a soft mechanical chime that felt louder than it should have. Rowan remained behind his desk while the receptionist guided them into the conference room across from his office. He watched through the glass wall before entering, giving himself a moment to study them as they studied his world. Patricia stood stiffly beside the table, her posture unchanged by time, though uncertainty flickered beneath it. Melissa's gaze moved across the skyline view and polished surfaces with open calculation. Eric lingered near the doorway as if unsure whether he belonged inside. Leonard spoke continuously in low tones, already constructing explanations before conversation had begun. Rowan stepped in only after they noticed him, and silence settled instantly. For several seconds nobody spoke. Recognition required adjustment. Patricia finally smiled in a way meant to bridge years quickly, telling him how proud she was seeing his success. The words sounded rehearsed rather than discovered. They sat, and Leonard began outlining recent hardships, business setbacks, rising debts, unfortunate investments. He emphasized how families must support each other during difficult seasons and suggested opportunities within Rowan's company where relatives could contribute. Melissa added that she had management experience and could help with public relations. Eric mentioned he was willing to learn anything available. Patricia reached for Rowan's hand, saying they had always believed he would achieve something meaningful and that distance had simply been misunderstanding. Rowan listened without interrupting, hands folded calmly. When they finished, he opened a drawer and placed a printed copy of their final message from years ago on the table, the one telling him not to attend the holiday gathering because he was an embarrassment. The room shifted. He spoke evenly, describing nights in the coal department, lines at the food bank, and the day every number stopped connecting. Not accusing, simply recounting. The contrast between their narrative and his memory removed pretense more effectively than anger could. Patricia's expression tightened. She insisted they had been overwhelmed and assumed he wanted independence. Leonard argued that pride prevented them from interfering. Rowan asked quietly whether blocking his calls had also been respect. No one answered. He explained that during those years strangers became allies, a librarian who extended computer time, co-workers who trusted his judgment, a neighbor who shared meals without questions. They had formed his support when family chose distance. He clarified he no longer carried resentment, but he also no longer carried expectation. Meridian Gate was built by people who stood present during uncertainty. Positions inside it required trust forged under pressure, not blood relation discovered after recognition. His tone never rose, yet finality entered each sentence. The requests shifted then from employment to financial assistance. Melissa admitted they faced losing their house. Leonard proposed a loan, promising repayment once situations stabilized. Eric said little, only looking at the floor. Rowan paused long enough to consider whether obligation remained simply because history existed. He realized helping out of guilt would rebuild the same imbalance that once broke him. Calmly he declined, explaining he hoped they found solutions but he would not become their solution. Security arrived at his earlier signal and waited discreetly near the door. Patricia stood slowly, disappointment replacing confidence. Before leaving she asked if this meant he no longer considered them family. Rowan answered that family required presence in hardship as much as celebration in success, and absence had consequences time could not erase. They departed without argument, the hallway absorbing their footsteps until silence returned. Rowan remained in the conference room several minutes after, not shaken as he once imagined but unexpectedly steady. The confrontation felt less like severing ties and more like acknowledging reality already formed. He returned to his office where the operations board displayed shipments crossing multiple regions in synchronized motion. Work awaited, indifferent to personal history. He resumed reviewing route metrics, discovering concentration came easily. That evening he visited the library carrying a donation agreement expanding its technical learning center. Mrs. Whitcomb accepted it with quiet pride, reminding him growth mattered most when it widened paths for others. Later he met Clara at a small cafe near her hospital. He told her what happened in simple terms. She asked whether he felt lighter. Rowan considered carefully and said yes, not because he rejected them, but because he no longer waited for them. They walked outside into cool night air discussing future plans rather than past wounds. Weeks passed and life continued without interruption. Meridian Gate prepared for international expansion, Maya arguing excitedly about infrastructure design while Rowan coordinated partnerships. During a late evening review he paused by the office window overlooking the city lights and recognized a peace unfamiliar yet solid. The need to prove himself had dissolved, only the responsibility to continue building remained. He closed the day's reports, turned off the office lights, and left the building not as someone escaping history but as someone finished carrying it. That's all for today. Like, subscribe, and see you in the next episode. Stay tuned.